Lord be with you. Reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees have taken their seat on the chair of Moses. Therefore, do and observe all things whatsoever they tell you, but do not follow their example. For they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to carry, and they lay them on people's shoulders, but they will not lift a finger to move them. All their works are performed to be seen. They widen their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. They love places of honor at banquets and seats of honor in synagogues, greetings in marketplaces, and the salutation, Rabbi. As for you, do not be called Rabbi. You have but one teacher, and you are all brothers. Call no one on earth your father. You have but one Father in heaven. Do not be called master. You have but one master, the Christ. The greatest among you must be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but whoever humbles himself will be exalted." The Gospel of the Lord. The readings today contrast humility with pride. And when we're humble, our hearts are opened up to God's forgiveness and His compassion. His love can come into us. But when we're full of pride, our hearts are shut down. That can't happen, doesn't happen. In our Gospel today, there's a great example of very prideful Pharisees and scribes. Their pride is, they take places of honor wherever they go. They want to be seen. They want to look like whatever they're doing is more religious than everybody else, show that they are the holy ones as they walk around. They even dress a little bit strange. You heard the words, they widen their phylacteries and they lengthen their tassels. Well, the phylacteries something about the size of a matchbox with little strings so they can tie it around their head, just like you have an eye patch. Well, this would be over the middle of your forehead. And in that little box, there'd be scripture, usually 4 little pieces of scripture, like the greatest commandment, love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. But their phylacteries would be 2 or 3 times the size of normal phylacteries, so people could see them and think that they're thinking harder on those scriptures than anybody else, so they have bigger phylacteries. And then their tassels. So in their cloaks, they'd have tassels, but instead of maybe a little 1-inch tassel to remind them of the commandments and remind them to follow the commandments, they might have a really bold set of 4-inch long tassels so everybody can know that they know the commandments. And so that's how they dress. And so they're very prideful the way they act and the way they dress. And the problem with that is in all that pride, they don't see themselves, they see themselves so religious and so holy that they don't need God's forgiveness and they don't need God's compassion. What they deserve is the admiration of everybody and honor. And that's what pride is. And that pride locks them out of God's love. They lock themselves out of receiving God's compassion and love. Jesus insists on us being humble. And Jesus was very humble himself, and he leads by example. So imagine Jesus, the creator of the universe, decides to come to earth in a human body. Man, that's humble, I often It's terrible, but I think about, would I do that to an ant? And distance between me and Jesus is much greater than me and an ant, but I wouldn't do that to the ants, to go live with the ants because I felt sorry for the ants or had compassion for the ants. But Jesus did that for us. And then he does another huge act of humility is he comes to each one of us in the Eucharist. So in the form of the Eucharist, he humbles himself so he can come into us, so he can share his love with us. And it's an unbelievable, beautiful act of humility, which we're all grateful and thankful for. But our first reading also has a great example of humility. And the last 2 days we've been reading from the Book of Ruth. And I'll recap just quickly so that you can put it all together. Naomi, that's Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi and her husband and her 2 sons are living in Bethlehem. There's a famine there. So they leave and go to Moab. So Moab is a pagan territory at the southeast end of the Dead Sea. So it's about a 50-mile trek from Bethlehem around the Dead Sea to Moab. And there's a big plain there. And they heard there was food there. So they go there and they live. And while they're there, Naomi's 2 sons marry pagan women, Moabites. And eventually her husband dies, and then her 2 sons die. And Naomi is left with these 2 daughter-in-laws. And she decides to go back to Bethlehem. She's heard they have food again. And she releases her daughter-in-laws. Well, one of them goes back to her pagan gods and her people. But the other one, Ruth, says, no, I'm going to stay with you, Naomi. And I'm going to worship your God. And I'm going to continue to be faithful to you. And she's very good to Naomi. And so the 2 make that trek back to Bethlehem. But they have nothing, And Naomi's a foreigner now in Israel. So in today's reading, she gets up and tells Naomi, I'm going to go and find a field that's been picked, and I'm going to see if I can glean any grain of it. So she's going looking for scraps in a field that's been harvested, so heads of grain. And when she's out there, the field belongs to Boaz. And Boaz is a relative of Naomi's. And he has heard about all the wonderful things that Ruth had done to Naomi and was still doing. And so he said, hey, it's a very humble thing she had to do, go out alone, a woman, out into the fields to collect this food. So Boaz has compassion for her. He says, listen, you can pick in my fields. As my men go to the next field, you can follow them through there. Here's where the water's kept. You can have as much water you want to drink. I'll tell the men to leave you alone. You're safe here. And Ruth's response is she falls to the ground, prostrate. And she says, what have I done to deserve all of this wonderful gift of your generosity? And it's like Naomi says, I don't deserve any of this. I don't deserve your generosity. I'm a foreigner, a woman, a former pagan. And so she really humbles herself in front of Boaz. And then at the end of our gospel, it says, those who humble themselves will be exalted. And then Ruth is exalted. Boaz marries her, which is a great thing. So now they have some stability and source of income. They don't have to go begging. And then they have a child. And the child is Obed. And maybe these names are familiar to you because you remember the genealogies are long, but in December we do the genealogy of Christ. And Obed is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of King David. And 28 generations after that is Jesus. So Ruth becomes an ancestor of Jesus. It's kind of a neat thing. Incredible, the humble will be exalted. So the takeaway from today's readings for me is we need to be humble. We need to be humble in front of God so that our hearts can be opened up to the forgiveness He has for us and the compassion that He has for us. And then we need to avoid the sins of pride, thinking that we're better, more holy, don't need God's forgiveness, that sort of thing. We need to avoid that. And I was just going to end with the last line in today's gospel, which is, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but whoever humbles himself will be exalted. So ask God to help us to become humble.
This is your invitation to give yourself a beautiful gift. Are you interested in Catholicism, learning more about the Catholic faith? We have a process here at Our Lady of the Gulf to teach, to grow in faith, and we want you to join.